In the frozen autumn of 1552, according to both Hungarian and Ottoman chronicles, 2,100 defenders made an army of 40,000 elite Ottoman warriors withdraw in humiliation. Not through superior weapons, not through miraculous intervention, through something the Sultan's generals had never encountered. A fortress where women poured molten lead, where a Lutheran scholar turned water wheels into weapons of mass destruction, and where every single person inside chose death over surrender. Think about those numbers. Modern historians, cross-referencing Hungarian, Ottoman, and Italian sources, confirm approximately 2,100 defenders against 35,000 to 40,000 Ottoman troops. Contemporary Ottoman chroniclers themselves documented this defeat. The ratio? Nearly 20 to 1. The fortress? Eger Castle in northern Hungary. The year the Ottoman Empire was at its absolute peak. By the end of this video, you'll understand how documented historical sources reveal the tactical brilliance, architectural advantages, and psychological warfare that turned an undermanned medieval fortress into the grave of Ottoman invincibility. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that historians confirm changed the course of European history. First, the explosive innovations recorded in contemporary accounts. A water wheel packed with gunpowder that witnesses called fire that multiplied itself. Second, why Ottoman sources themselves recorded women defenders as one of their most terrifying obstacles. Documented evidence of civilians becoming warriors. Third, the command friction between Ottoman generals that multiple chroniclers noted contributed more to the defense than any Hungarian strategy. But here's what makes this siege historically fascinating and frustratingly incomplete. How did a garrison with only 6 large cannons withstand nearly 12,000 cannonballs documented to have landed inside the fortress? What tactical innovation, recorded by the 16th century Hungarian bard Sebastian Tinodi, who chronicled events shortly after the siege, allowed infantry to neutralize the world's finest cavalry? Why did the Ottomans, who had just captured Temesvar, Szolnok, and 25 other fortresses, suddenly withdraw from a fortress they had nearly breached? And why do historians still debate whether this victory delayed Ottoman expansion toward Vienna by decades or merely postponed the inevitable? To understand how 39 days in autumn 1552 created Hungary's most enduring legend, we need to step back to 1526, when a single catastrophic battle fractured an entire kingdom. August 29th, 1526. The flower of Hungarian knighthood, drowned in mud and Ottoman arrows at a place called Mohács. In less than 2 hours of slaughter, the Kingdom of Hungary ceased to exist as an independent power. Young King Louis II, fleeing the battlefield in full armor, fell from his horse crossing a stream and drowned in water barely 3 feet deep. The symbolism was almost too perfect. Hungary itself was drowning. The Battle of Mohács wasn't just a military defeat. It was the death of Hungarian independence, carved into history by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent's scimitars. Contemporary chronicles record the field strewn with bodies. Estimates vary wildly, but all sources agree the Hungarian army was annihilated. The way was paved for an attack on the Danube basin, and nothing stood between Suleiman and the heartland of Christian Europe. What followed was worse than conquest. It was fragmentation. With Louis dead and no clear heir, 2 men claimed the Hungarian throne. Ferdinand I of Habsburg, elected by Western nobles in November 1526, secured control over roughly the western third of the country. John Sapolii, backed by Sultan Suleiman himself, claimed the throne and held the east. This wasn't just a succession dispute. it was proxy warfare, with the Ottoman Empire playing kingmaker to ensure Hungary remained divided. The Sultan's strategy was brilliant in its cynicism. Support Zápolyai against Ferdinand, watch the Hungarians bleed each other, and when the moment was right, take everything. In 1541, that moment arrived. A Habsburg army under Wilhelm von Roggendorf attempted to seize Buda, the Hungarian capital. They failed spectacularly. Suleiman's forces not only relieved the city, but occupied it permanently. On September 2nd, 1541, Buda became the seat of Ottoman power in Central Europe. The occupation of Buda formalized what historians call the tripartition. Central Hungary, including the former royal capital, became the Eyalet of Buda under direct Ottoman administration. Eastern Hungary, Transylvania, became a vassal principality under Zápolyai's infant son, John Sigismund. Paying annual tribute to Constantinople, Habsburg Royal Hungary was confined to the northwest, a rump state clinging to the edges of what had once been a great kingdom. Not just a military defeat, but the dismemberment of a nation. And Suleiman wasn't finished. Between 1543 and 1544, Ottoman forces systematically captured the fortress ring protecting what remained of Royal Hungary. Székesfehérvár fell. Pécs surrendered. Esztergom and Visegrad, ancient seats of Hungarian power, opened their gates. Each fortress lost created an enormous gap in the defensive system, and each gap invited further conquest. By 1552, the map of Hungary looked like an open wound. The Ottoman Empire controlled the fertile central plains, the major river routes, and the strategic fortresses that had once made Hungary the shield of Christian Europe. What remained of Royal Hungary depended on a thin line of border castles, the Végvár system, most of which were undermanned, undersupplied, and expecting no help from Vienna. An entire kingdom shattered in a single afternoon at Mohács, and nearly 3 decades later, the fracture lines still bled. By 1552, Sultan Suleiman was about to pour salt into that wound. The campaign he launched that year would be his attempt to finish what Mohács started: the complete separation of Habsburg Hungary from Transylvania, ensuring Ottoman dominance would be permanent, unchallengeable, absolute. Late spring, 1552. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, at the peak of his power, watched his realm stretch from the Persian Gulf to the gates of Vienna. But one thing gnawed at him. His vassal province of Transylvania, ruled by the infant John Sigismund under his mother's regency, faced pressure from the Habsburg King Ferdinand. Ferdinand's agents were maneuvering, negotiating, scheming to unite Royal Hungary with Transylvania. This, Suleiman would not tolerate. Istanbul's response was swift and overwhelming. As one Hungarian source documents, the Sublime Porte would not permit the Viennese king to reclaim its vassal province, and set out to put a stop, once and for all, to any attempts to unite the kingdom. In late spring 1552, Ottoman armies started an offensive against the Kingdom of Hungary on multiple fronts. The Sultan deployed 3 commanders, each a veteran of conquest. Kara Ahmed Pasha, the second vizier, and Serdar, commander-in-chief, led the largest contingent. Ahmed was of Albanian origin, brought up in the Topkapı Palace, a man who had married into the Sultan's family by wedding Fatma Sultan, daughter of Selim I. He would later become Grand Vizier, though his ambition would prove his undoing in 1555, when palace intrigues led to his execution. But in 1552, he was the Sultan's fist. Hadim Ali Pasha, governor of Buda, commanded the second force. Though technically junior to Ahmed, Ali possessed superior strategic talent and specialized skill in artillery management. His battery of siege guns would prove the most effective weapon in the campaign. The third commander, Mehmed Sokolu, Beglerby of Rumelia, brought European levies and would later become one of the most powerful Grand Viziers in Ottoman history. The campaign began with systematic annihilation. Hadim Ali Pasha's troops from Buda first relieved the castle of Szeged, under siege by Hungarian irregulars on the first day of March. In summer, they took the castle of Veszprém by siege. In the county of Nógrád, a series of fortresses fell in rapid succession: Buzsák, Dregeli, Széchenyi. Each conquest demonstrated Ottoman military superiority and Hungarian inability to coordinate defense. Kara Ahmed Pasha, meanwhile, struck at Transylvania itself. His target, Temesvar, the gateway fortress. Istvan Losonci, Ispan of Temes, defended the fort with 2,300 Hungarian, Spanish, and Czech soldiers. Contemporary accounts describe a heroic defense, but heroism couldn't overcome mathematics. On July 26, 1552, after sustained bombardment and mining operations, Temesvar fell. Losonci and his men were slaughtered or enslaved. The road to Transylvania lay open. But Ahmed didn't advance into Transylvania. Instead, his army united with Ali Pasha's forces at Szolnok. On September 4, 1552, after a brief siege, Szolnok Castle fell, giving the Ottomans command over the second largest waterway in the country, the Tisza River. Historical records document that during the campaign, Ottoman forces occupied Timișoara, Veszprém, Széchenyi, Holoko, Buzsák, Lipa, Lugos, Karansebes, Dregeli, and several smaller fortresses. At the end of July, there was an enormous gap in the Hungarian border castle system. The crowning objective of this successful campaign would be the capture of Eger, the gate of Upper Hungary. Possession of this fortress would physically separate the Habsburg-controlled north from Transylvania in the east. North of Eger lay the poorly reinforced city of Kassa, present-day Košice, the center of an important region of mines and associated mints. These mines provided the Hungarian kingdom with large amounts of quality silver and gold coinage, the lifeblood of Ferdinand's ability to pay for defense. Besides allowing a takeover of that revenue source, contemporary strategic analysis suggests that the fall of Eger would enable the Ottoman Empire to secure an alternate logistic and troop route for further westward military expansion, possibly allowing the Turks to lay sieges to Vienna more frequently. Not just military conquest, but economic strangulation. Control the mines, control the money, control the money, control the kingdom. The two Ottoman armies, flush with victory, had captured some 25 Hungarian strongholds in a single campaign season. They united at Szolnok on September 4th. Their target, a second-rate fortress commanded by a minor nobleman named Istvan Dobo. The Ottomans had crushed every opposition they'd faced. Professional soldiers, mercenary garrisons, Spanish and Czech veterans. Why would Eger be different? Few expected resistance. The Ottomans certainly didn't. They were about to discover that sometimes the second-rate fortress and the minor nobleman make history. Baron Istvan Dobo de Ruska, born around 1502 into minor Hungarian nobility, married to Sara Sulyok on October 17, 1550, father of two children, Ferenc and Christina, holdings in northern Hungary. By any measure, an unremarkable man in an age of giants. Except for one detail. Istvan Dobo was a man who understood that sometimes the unremarkable must become extraordinary or die trying. Historical records document his consistent loyalty. In the dynastic succession struggles after the Battle of Mohács in 1526, Dobo was consistently on the side of the Habsburg King Ferdinand I rather than that of John Zapolya. This wasn't opportunism. Northern Hungarian nobles like Dobo knew that the Ottoman-backed Zapolya represented eventual subjugation. Ferdinand, whatever his flaws, represented the possibility of continued Christian independence. Dobo chose his side and never wavered. He came of age in a Hungary torn apart by catastrophe, a man forged in the fires of political intrigue and war, watching his kingdom fracture, watching fortress after fortress fall to Ottoman siege trains. By 1549, when Ferdinand appointed him captain of Eger Castle, Dobo was approximately 47 years old, a hardened veteran entrusted with guarding northern passes vital for Habsburg supply lines. Eger wasn't a prize appointment. It was a death sentence waiting to happen. The castle sat at a strategic choke point, the last significant obstacle between Ottoman-controlled central Hungary and the wealthy mining districts of Upper Hungary. Everyone knew Eger would be targeted eventually. The only question was when. Dobo knew. Weeks before the Turks arrived in September 1552, contemporary Hungarian sources document that the captain of the castle was aware of the importance of defending the fortress. He wrote a letter to Vienna asking for help. He gathered the fleeing inhabitants of the area behind the castle walls, swelling his garrison to more than 2,000 people. Peasants who had fled the Ottoman advance, townspeople from Eger itself, a few dozen women who refused to abandon their homes. Professional soldiers numbered perhaps 1,500 to 1,600 combat-ready personnel out of the total 2,100 to 2,300 people sheltering inside the castle walls. Vienna sent nothing. No reinforcements. No supplies beyond what Dobo had already stockpiled. No promise of relief. Ferdinand's court, dealing with its own political crises and stretched resources, left Eger to its fate. Some commanders would have surrendered at that point. Why die for a king who wouldn't support you? But Dobo was literally fighting for his family's birthright. His estates lay in northern Hungary, in the path of any Ottoman expansion. If Eger fell, his family's lands would be next. This wasn't abstract loyalty to a distant Habsburg monarch. This was a man defending his homeland, his family's future, everything he had. Historical accounts record that after the siege, Dobo and his officers resigned their commissions in protest of King Ferdinand's refusal to contribute any material help to the defense. That bitterness, the sense of abandonment, would define his later relationship with the Habsburg court, even after he was rewarded with territories and titles for his victory. A man who saved Upper Hungary but never forgave those who left him to do it alone. Not just a commander, but a man who understood the stakes with perfect clarity. The novelist Géza Gardonyi, writing in 1899 and drawing from 16th century sources, portrayed Dobo telling his men something to the effect of, "Better a few lions than many rabbits." Whether those exact words were spoken, the sentiment was clear in his actions. Dobo needed warriors who would fight knowing they might not survive. He got them. By early September 1552, with Ottoman banners visible on the southern horizon, Istvan Dobo stood on Eger's walls and took stock. 2,100 souls inside the fortress. Perhaps 1,600 who could actually fight. 6 large cannons, about a dozen smaller guns, maybe 300 trench guns with ample ammunition supplies. Walls built on ancient foundations. Strong but not modern trace Italian fortifications. Underground casemates carved into volcanic rock. Enough gunpowder and food for a sustained siege, if they were careful. Against this, the largest Ottoman army assembled in Hungary since the fall of Buda. Dobo would need every lion he could find, starting with a Lutheran scholar who knew more about explosives than any man in Hungary, Æthelstan Bornemissza. Born in Pécs, 1526, 26 years old in September 1552. Educated, which made him unusual for a common soldier. Lutheran, which made him controversial in a kingdom where religious tensions ran high. Married twice. Infantry commander of 250 men. And an alchemist who was about to reinvent siege warfare. Historical sources describe Bornemissza as an educated man, likely trained in what Hungarians called diák, clerical or literary studies. This suggests he could read Latin, understood basic scientific principles, and possessed knowledge that went beyond the typical soldier's training. His Protestant faith also set him apart. In an age when religion defined identity and loyalty, a Lutheran commanding Catholic troops in defense of a Catholic kingdom's interests demonstrates either remarkable trust or desperate necessity. Probably both. Among the approximately 1,500 combat-ready personnel in Eger's garrison, Bornemissza commanded a detachment of 250 Hungarian infantry. But contemporary accounts make clear that it was his skill with explosives that would make his name immortal. During the siege, chroniclers document that Bornemissza devised primitive but lethal grenades and powder keg-sized bombs to use against the attackers. The most famous invention, the fire wheel. Multiple historical sources document this weapon, though descriptions vary in detail. The basic design was straightforward, a watermill wheel packed with gunpowder. But the execution required genius. Bornemissza understood that a simple explosion would create a flash and noise, but limited sustained damage. What he needed was a weapon that would continue burning, spreading fire and terror across Ottoman ranks as it rolled downhill from Eger's elevated position. Contemporary witnesses described it as fire that multiplied itself. Whether through gunpowder mixed with oil and sulfur, or through some other incendiary compound Bornemissza's alchemical knowledge suggested, the fire wheel became more than an explosion. It became a rolling inferno that showered attackers with burning debris, ignited siege equipment, and created psychological terror that matched its physical destruction. But the fire wheel was just the beginning. Historical accounts document that Bornemissza developed handheld grenades, jars filled with hot resin and shards of metal or stone, early fragmentation devices that defenders could hurl onto siege ladders. He created powder keg bombs, large canisters filled with incendiary mixtures that could be dropped manually into Ottoman trenches. Sources describe defenders pouring what they called incendiary soup, a mixture of boiling oil and pitch that remained flammable even after being poured, ensuring that any Ottoman soldier who attempted to scale the walls was engulfed in flames. Not a grizzled 40-year veteran, but a 26-year-old scholar applying theoretical knowledge to practical slaughter. Bornemissza represents something remarkable in 16th century warfare: the intersection of academic learning and military innovation. His education gave him access to knowledge about chemistry, pyrotechnics, and combustion that typical soldiers lacked. His position as infantry commander gave him authority to implement his ideas. His Lutheran faith perhaps gave him a different perspective on warfare. Less concern for chivalric codes, more focus on whatever worked. He was about to terrify an empire, and the empire would make him pay for it. 2 years after Eger's defense, in 1554, Bornemissza was captured by Ottoman raiders during a patrol. Historical records document that he was taken to Constantinople and interrogated. The Ottomans wanted to know the secrets of Eger's defenses. How did the underground casemates work? What were the formulas for his incendiary weapons? Where were the weak points in the fortress that had defeated 40,000 warriors? Bornemissza, demonstrating the same resolve he showed on Eger's walls, refused to betray his country. In 1555, he was executed by hanging in Constantinople. The man who had made fire serve Hungary's defense died because he wouldn't reveal how he did it. His inventions died with him, preserved only in the general descriptions that filtered into chronicles. The precise formulas, the exact mechanisms, lost. But in September 1552, as Ottoman armies approached from the south, Gergely Bornemisza's innovations were ready. The weapons were prepared, the compounds mixed, the fire wheels positioned. All he needed now was for the enemy to come within range. They would. And when they did, Ottoman soldiers would learn that sometimes the pen truly is mightier than the sword. Especially when the scholar holding the pen also knows how to make gunpowder explode. Eger Castle sat on a hilltop east of the town, dominating the southern and western approaches. The location wasn't ideal from a purely military perspective. It overlooked only part of the walled settlement below. But what it lacked in coverage, it compensated for in elevation and geology. Built in the 13th century, on the ruins of an earlier stone fort, which itself replaced an ancient earthen encampment possibly erected by the Huns, the fortress had foundations stronger than typical medieval construction. This would matter more than anyone realized. The castle comprised an inner and outer fortress, a layered defense system that required attackers to breach multiple perimeters even after penetrating the outer walls. Historical records document 6 major bastions protecting the walls. The Earth Bastion and Prison Bastion stood to the northwest. The Sandor Bastion anchored the north wall, covering the steepest slope, making infantry assaults from that direction nearly suicidal. The Balaki Bastion protected the northeast corner, controlling visibility over approaches from the Buk Mountains. The Bebek Bastion guarded the eastern corner of the outer fortress, preventing flanking maneuvers from the Eger Valley. The Dobo Bastion, named, ironically, before Istvan Dobo's command, held the western wall. The Varkalk Gate sat on the southern wall of the inner fortress, featuring wolf pits and a counterweighted drawbridge. This gate, according to later accounts, would withstand the entire 39-day siege without being breached. At the center of the wall, separating inner and outer fortresses, the church bastion provided a final fallback position if the outer defenses collapsed. But the fortress's true strength lay underground. Carved into the volcanic rhyolite rock beneath the castle, a complex system of tunnels and cellars, the casemates, served 3 critical functions. First, secure transit. Defenders could move between bastions without exposing themselves to the continuous Ottoman bombardment that everyone knew was coming. Second, storage. The casemates housed what contemporary records suggest was approximately 24 metric tons of black gunpowder, along with food supplies necessary for a prolonged siege. Third, and most ingeniously, acoustic detection. Historical accounts describe sentinels stationed in the underground passages using primitive but effective methods to detect Ottoman mining operations. Sources document that these sentinels monitored the movement of peas placed on drumheads. When enemy sappers tunneled close enough, the vibrations would make the peas dance on the drum skin. This early warning system enabled Hungarian defenders to drill countermines and plant charges to destroy Ottoman trenches before they reached the foundations. The geology itself became a weapon. The fortress of Eger was built on ruins that replaced earthen encampments possibly erected centuries earlier, making the foundations stronger than usual and greatly hindering the work of Ottoman miners. The rhyolite rock, a volcanic stone of exceptional hardness, proved nearly impervious to 16th century mining tools. Every attempt by Ottoman sappers to tunnel under the walls meant chipping through stone that broke iron picks and exhausted experienced miners. Not just thick walls, but walls built on volcanic stone that would snap Ottoman mining tools like kindling. The defenders had 6 large cannons and about a dozen smaller ones, plus approximately 300 trench guns with ample supplies of ammunition. Dobo had hired 6 cannon masters from Germany to make the most efficient use of Eger's artillery. These specialists understood trajectory, powder charges, and timing in ways that typical Hungarian gunners didn't. Every shot from Eger's limited battery would be calculated for maximum impact. The Ottomans had the numbers, the artillery, the experience. They had just conquered 25 fortresses in a single campaign season. They had siege engineers from China, the finest artillery in the Muslim world, and commanders who had reduced greater fortifications to rubble. But they were about to discover that in siege warfare, geology beats geometry, rock beats experience, and a fortress that has chosen its ground wisely can make mathematics irrelevant. On September 9th, 1552, though some sources cite September 4th or 11th. Most modern historians accept the 9th as the formal investment date, that geology would face its greatest test. Because approaching from the south came an army that had never failed to take a fortress. An army so confident in its superiority that it had already begun planning the victory celebrations. Confidence can be a weapon. It can also be a fatal weakness. Early September, 1552. Scouts brought news that turned every stomach in Eger. The horizon south of the fortress had disappeared beneath Ottoman banners. For miles in every direction, the plain writhed with men and horses and the machinery of siege warfare on an industrial scale. Old Hungarian sources and the romantic estimates from Géza Gardonyi's 1899 novel claimed the Ottoman army numbered 150,000 to 200,000 men. Modern historical research, cross-referencing Ottoman administrative records with contemporary European observers, provides a more realistic but still overwhelming figure. The Ottoman army numbered 35,000 to 40,000 men from the Rumelian army, an Anatolian contingent, and the troops of Hadim Ali Pasha from Buda. Think about those numbers. 35,000 to 40,000 professional Ottoman soldiers against Eger's 2,100 to 2,300 total inhabitants, of whom only approximately 1,500 were combat ready. That's roughly a 23-to-1 numerical advantage for the attackers. In siege warfare, where defenders traditionally held advantages, a 3-to-1 ratio favored the attacker. 10-to-1 made victory almost certain. 23-to-1. Military historians considered it suicide to resist. But numbers tell only part of the story. The Ottoman siege train represented centuries of military evolution distilled into perfect lethality. Contemporary sources document that the Ottomans deployed 16 zarbuzans, very large siege cannons, as well as 150 medium and smaller pieces of artillery. A fleet of 2,000 camels proved highly useful in the collection and transportation of wood to the site. Used for constructing temporary siege platforms, mantlets, and the wooden infrastructure necessary for sustained bombardment. Command was divided among the 3 pashas who had devastated Hungary all summer. Kara Ahmed Pasha, the Sirdar and senior commander, contributed twice as many troops to the United Army. But historical accounts note that Hadim Ali Pasha showed more strategic talent and proved his skill in artillery. Ali's battery of just 4 large siege guns would prove the most effective Ottoman weapon, badly damaging the castle walls through precise, sustained fire. Mehmed Sokolu brought the European levies and his reputation as a rising star in Ottoman military circles. Inside Eger's walls, the defenders comprised a mixture that defied traditional military categorization. The fortress was defended by 2,100 to 2,300 people, including professional soldiers, peasants fleeing the Ottoman advance, townspeople from Eger itself, and a few dozen women who refused to evacuate. Among the approximately 1,500 combat-ready personnel, there were only a handful of foreign mercenaries. Dobo's 6 German cannon masters represented the sum total of international military expertise available to the defense. The defenders had 6 large cannons and about a dozen smaller ones, plus approximately 300 trench guns with ample ammunition. Against the Ottomans' 166 pieces of artillery, this represented an 8-to-1 disadvantage in firepower, before accounting for the size difference of the weapons themselves. On September 9th, 1552, the Ottomans completed their investment of the fortress. Contemporary Hungarian sources document that the pashas launching the siege sent an order to surrender to the castle defenders. Standard siege protocol dictated offering honorable terms before beginning bombardment. Surrender now. Keep your lives and limited property. Resist and face the consequences of defying the Sultan's will. The Turks waited 7 days for a reply. Dobo never bothered to send one. On September 16th, having received no response, the Ottoman artillery opened fire. What followed would be documented by both sides as one of the most sustained and intensive bombardments in 16th century warfare. The Ottoman High Command expected walls to crumble within days, morale to collapse within a week, and gates to open shortly thereafter. They had seen this pattern repeat across Hungary all summer. Temesvar fell after heroic resistance. Szolnok capitulated after a brief siege. 25 fortresses had fallen, some after token resistance, most after calculating that survival beats honor when facing impossible odds. What the Ottomans got instead was silence to their surrender demand, and the first hint that something had gone very wrong with their mathematical certainties. By sunset on September 16th, when the first day of bombardment ended, Ottoman forward observers reported an unsettling detail. Despite sustained artillery fire from 16 siege cannons, Eger's walls showed damage, but no breach. Despite the psychological pressure of encirclement by 40,000 warriors, no white flags appeared on the ramparts. The defenders' answer to the surrender demand wasn't written in words. It would be written in fire, blood, and Ottoman casualties that would mount with every passing day. September 16th, 1552. The first volley from the Ottoman battery shook dust from walls that had stood for 3 centuries. Then the second, then the third, and then the rhythm of destruction began. A mechanical drumbeat of iron against stone that would continue almost without pause for 13 days. Contemporary sources document the scale of this bombardment. By the time the siege ended on October 17th or 18th, almost 12,000 cannonballs had landed inside the fortress. This figure excludes the hundreds of projectiles that stuck in the walls themselves or missed entirely. 12,000 impacts. 12,000 moments when defenders braced for collapse. 12,000 times stone dust filled the air. And men wondered if this would be the shot that finally broke through. The Ottoman artillery represented the cutting edge of 16th century siege technology. 16 Zarbuzans provided the heavy firepower, massive cannons that required teams of men and horses to position and reload. The mathematics of siege warfare suggested that sustained fire from this many heavy guns should reduce medieval fortifications to rubble within a week at most. But mathematics hadn't accounted for Hadim Ali Pasha's tactical insight. Historical accounts note that Ahmed Pasha was the senior commander and contributed twice as many troops to the united army. But Ali showed more strategic talent and proved his skill in artillery. Ali's battery consisted of just 4 large siege guns, but these 4 proved more effective than Ahmed's much larger complement. Ali positioned his cannons with precision, concentrated fire on specific targets, primarily the gate towers and the northern bastions, and understood something about siege warfare that raw firepower alone couldn't achieve. Consistency matters more than volume. The psychological impact was calculated. Ottoman gunners maintained a steady rate of fire designed not just to damage walls, but to break mines. Sleep became impossible. Every moment brought the shriek of incoming projectiles, the crash of impact, the cascade of stone fragments. Defenders learned to recognize the sound of different cannon types, estimating trajectory and impact point in the seconds between firing and arrival. It was a skill you learned quickly or died ignorant. But the fortress held. The rhyolite foundations that had seemed merely geological curiosity proved to be salvation. The volcanic rock absorbed energy that would have shattered conventional limestone or sandstone fortifications. Upper battlements cratered. Gate towers cracked. The outer walls showed visible damage, yet no breach opened wide enough for massed infantry assault. And then the Ottoman supply problems began. During the siege, historical records document that the Ottoman army ran out of gunpowder and cannonballs at least twice, limiting Ahmed's use of heavy artillery for a week or more at different points in the siege. When metal ammunition was exhausted, Ottoman artillerymen showed remarkable improvisation. Contemporary sources describe them carving cannonballs out of marble when metal supplies ran low. These marble projectiles were less effective than iron or stone shot. They shattered on impact more easily, delivered less kinetic force. But they maintained the psychological pressure of continuous bombardment. Inside Eger, the defenders fought their own artillery battle with limited resources. 6 large cannons manned by German specialists returned fire with calculated precision. Every shot had to count. The Hungarian gunners couldn't match Ottoman volume, but they could disrupt siege works, destroy mantlets, and force Ottoman infantry to keep their distance from the walls. The approximately 300 trench guns, smaller anti-personnel weapons, waited silently. Their time would come when Ottoman soldiers attempted to scale the walls. For 13 days, the bombardment continued with mechanical regularity. 12,000 cannonballs. Think about that number. If the siege lasted 39 days total, and bombardment occupied roughly 30 days of continuous fire, that's 400 cannonballs per day. Roughly 17 per hour if firing continued around the clock, which historical accounts suggest it did. Every 3.5 minutes, another projectile. For 30 days, the fortress absorbed punishment that should have destroyed it. Structural damage accumulated. Sections of upper wall collapsed. The gate towers, primary targets, showed cracks that deepened with each direct hit. But the foundations, those ancient volcanic foundations, held. The walls stood, and every day that passed without a breach was a small victory that eroded Ottoman confidence and vindicated Dobo's decision to resist. After 2 weeks of sustained bombardment, Ottoman officers surveyed the damage and congratulated each other on preliminary success. The walls showed visible cracks. The gate towers appeared ready to collapse. Morale inside the fortress must be breaking. All signs pointed to imminent surrender or successful assault. They had no idea they'd already lost. Because on September 29th, St. Michael's Day in the Hungarian religious calendar, Ahmed and Ali ordered what they believed would be a routine mop-up operation. The first major infantry assault combined with mining operations. The janissaries fixed their siege ladders. The sappers lit their fuses. Ottoman commanders prepared to take casualties they considered acceptable for a fortress this strategically important. And the women of Eger started boiling water. September 29th, 1552, St. Michael's Day. In Hungarian tradition, the day when summer ends and darkness begins its yearly conquest. The timing carried symbolic weight that both sides understood. The Ottomans chose their moment for maximum psychological impact. The assault concentrated on the section of wall between the Bibek Bastion and the Occoputeroni, the Old Gate Tower. Contemporary accounts from sources documenting the siege describe this as the most vulnerable section after 2 weeks of sustained artillery damage. The sector was defended by Gurgely, Bornemissza, and his 250 infantry. If any section might break under combined bombardment and infantry assault, the Ottomans calculated this was it. The attack began with Ottoman miners detonating charges they had spent days planting beneath the old gate. Historical records document that the explosion destroyed the gate structure and pulled down the wooden palisade built behind it as a secondary defense. The blast created a breach wide enough for massed infantry. Ottoman soldiers, seeing the smoke clear and the gap yawning before them, rushed forward in numbers. For a few terrible minutes, it worked. The Ottoman infantry pushed through the breach in strength. Janissaries, elite infantry who represented the Sultan's household troops, took up strong positions in the tower structure that stood over the old gate. From this elevated position, they could fire down on defenders trying to seal the breach, killing many and creating a tactical nightmare for Dobo. The enemy had penetrated the outer fortress and established a fortified position inside the defensive perimeter. This was the crisis moment. If the Ottomans could reinforce their foothold, expand from the tower, and fight their way into the inner fortress, the siege would end. Everything Dobo had planned, all the preparation, all the defiance of surrender demands, it would all collapse into the bloody chaos of a fortress taken by storm. But then the women of Eger entered history. Contemporary sources, including accounts that trace back to Sebastian Tinodi Lantos's 1553 Chronicle, written shortly after the siege, document what happened next. The women of Eger, sources estimate around 90 women total, approximately 40 of whom were ladies of nobility who refused to evacuate, actively repelled the Ottoman assaults. They threw stones from the walls. They poured boiling water onto attackers climbing siege ladders. They prepared cauldrons of molten bitumen, tar, and lead, substances that clung to armor and skin, burning through layers of protection that steel weapons couldn't penetrate. European sources from the period describe this participation with a mixture of admiration and shock. Ottoman chronicles and multiple modern historians note that Ottoman sources themselves mention the women defenders, recorded what they faced on Eger's walls. Turkish officers, accustomed to facing professional soldiers and even peasant militia, found themselves under fire from women who fought with desperate intensity. The substances they used created horror. Boiling water caused steam burns through armor joints. Molten bitumen stuck to metal and cloth, continuing to burn long after initial contact. Molten lead, heated to liquid state, was heavy enough to maintain temperature as it fell, creating wounds that contemporary medicine had no way to treat effectively. These weren't weapons of military tradition. They were weapons of total defense. Every person inside the fortress contributing to survival by any means necessary. Meanwhile, Dobo faced his impossible choice. The Janissaries holding the old gate tower were cutting down defenders trying to retake the position. Every minute they remained meant more Hungarian casualties and greater Ottoman reinforcement. Artillery couldn't dislodge them. the tower's stone construction provided too much protection. Infantry assault from below faced Turkish fire from above. Standard siege doctrine had no answer for this tactical problem. Dobo made a decision that contemporary sources document as both brilliant and horrifying. He was stationed on the Centeli Bastion, the Shrine Bastion, and he ordered all his largest cannons turned toward the enemy-held gate and tower where fighting still raged. The guns fired at near point-blank range into the structure. Historical accounts note that the volley destroyed the targets, killing friend and foe alike. The tower came down in a collapse of masonry and bodies. The breach, no longer defensible without the tower's covering fire, was quickly sealed by Hungarian forces, who poured into the gap before Ottoman reinforcements could arrive. The tower came down. Dozens of Ottoman soldiers died in the rubble. But so did Hungarian defenders, who had been fighting to retake the position. Dobo had fired on his own fortress, killed his own men, to prevent the Ottomans from exploiting their tactical success. When the smoke cleared and the tower's rubble settled, the Ottomans counted their gains. They had breached the gate through superior engineering. They had forced the Hungarian commander to destroy his own defensive structure. They had killed many defenders and proven that Eger could be penetrated. But they hadn't taken the fortress. The breach was sealed, the tower was gone, but the walls on either side still stood. And the cost in Ottoman casualties, both from the initial assault and from being buried in the tower's collapse, was becoming significant. For the first time, some Ottoman officers began calculating whether Eger was worth the price they were paying. St. Michael's Day had been the test. The Ottomans had proven they could breach the walls. The Hungarians had proven they would pay any price, including friendly fire, to prevent penetration of the inner fortress. October would bring the breaking point, because the Ottomans weren't done. The siege had 39 days to run, and neither was the weather. The end of September brought more than tactical stalemate. It brought the weather. Historical sources document that the end of autumn arrived earlier than usual, with heavy rain and freezing nighttime temperatures transforming the Ottoman siege camp in the valley below Eger into something approaching misery. The Ottomans had positioned their main camp in the lowlands, standard siege doctrine that provided flat ground for artillery placement and troop assembly. But what works in dry summer campaigns becomes catastrophe when early winter arrives. The valley floor, repeatedly churned by thousands of feet and hooves, turned into freezing mud that sucked at boots and made movement exhausting. Rain that in summer would have been merely uncomfortable became a daily assault on morale as temperatures dropped, 15 degrees below freezing at night. The kind of cold that makes metal burn bare skin, that turns breath to ice crystals before it leaves your mouth. Ottoman troops accustomed to campaigning in Anatolia, the Balkans, and the scorching heat of desert warfare found themselves shivering in tents designed for warmer climates. Firewood, already in high demand for siege operations, became critical for survival. The 2,000 camels that had been so useful for transporting construction materials now spent much of their energy hauling fuel. But the weather was only part of the crisis. Contemporary sources document that during the siege, the Ottoman army ran out of gunpowder and cannonballs at least twice, limiting the use of heavy artillery for a week or more at different points in the campaign. When this happened during the early autumn cold, it created cascading problems. Artillery crews sat idle, unable to maintain the psychological pressure of constant bombardment. Infantry assaults without adequate covering fire took heavier casualties. The entire siege momentum, built on the certainty of superior firepower, stalled. Food supplies also deteriorated. Historical accounts mention reduced rice rations and allegations of corruption among the officers, causing discontent among the Ottoman troops. The corruption charges are significant. In any pre-modern army, supply officers held positions of tremendous power and opportunity for personal enrichment. When rations decreased, while officers appeared well-fed, soldiers noticed. Discipline, the Ottoman military's greatest strength, began to crack under the pressure of cold, hunger, and mounting casualties for what was supposed to be an easy conquest. Disease followed inevitably. Whenever large armies camped in close quarters with inadequate sanitation, illness spread. The cold and wet accelerated this process. Dysentery, respiratory infections, and camp fever, likely typhus, began appearing in Ottoman ranks. Every soldier who fell ill weakened the army's effectiveness without Hungarian defenders firing a shot. Every death from disease represented trained manpower lost to a siege that was supposed to take days, not weeks. The psychological impact compounded. Ottoman soldiers who had marched through Hungary conquering fortress after fortress now found themselves stuck in freezing mud outside a second-rate castle, eating reduced rations, watching their comrades die of illness and Hungarian fire, and wondering when, if ever, their commanders would order them to move on. Inside Eger's walls, conditions weren't comfortable, but they were survivable. The defenders had prepared for siege. The casemates provided shelter from bombardment and weather. Food stores, carefully managed by Dobo, lasted through the siege with discipline and rationing. The garrison wasn't growing weaker with every passing day. They were holding steady, becoming more confident as Ottoman morale visibly deteriorated. Weather warfare. The fortress defenders hadn't planned for early autumn, but they adapted better than their attackers. Geography and geology had already favored the defense. Now, meteorology joined the alliance against the Sultan's army. By early October, the Ottomans faced a cruel calculation. They had already spent nearly a month besieging Eger. The campaign season was ending. Winter in Central Europe could make military operations impossible. Every additional day spent at Eger was a day not consolidating control over the 25 fortresses already captured. It was a day when supply lines stretched from Buda grew more vulnerable to Hungarian raiding parties. It was a day closer to having to winter in hostile territory or retreat with the objective unaccomplished. But to withdraw now, after all the casualties, after the artillery expenditure, after the public commitment to taking this fortress, that would be an admission of failure that no Ottoman commander wanted to make. Pride demanded one more attempt. Honor required proving that the Sultan's army could take any fortress it truly committed to capturing. So despite the cold, despite the supply problems, despite the mounting evidence that Eger was different from every other fortress they'd conquered, the Ottoman command prepared for renewed assault. October would bring the final storms. The question was whether the fortress could withstand what the Ottomans were about to unleash, or whether weather and mathematics would finally give way to Ottoman determination and superior numbers. The frozen mud of the siege camp told its own story. This wasn't going according to plan. But Ottoman pride wouldn't let them admit it. Not yet. Early October 1552. As Ottoman forces prepared for renewed assault, Battle of Brunanburh prepared his response. The fire wheels, the incendiary devices he had spent weeks constructing, waited in the casemates. Contemporary accounts document what happened when the scholars' weapons met the Ottoman infantry in actual combat. The assault came at the vulnerable sectors identified during the September 29th attack. Ottoman forces, having learned from previous failures, coordinated infantry assault with renewed artillery bombardment and mining operations. They came in waves. Professional soldiers moving forward under covering fire, carrying siege ladders that they would plant against walls damaged by 2 weeks of sustained bombardment. And then they met fire that refused to behave like normal fire. Historical sources document that during the siege, Bornemissza deployed the watermill wheel packed with gunpowder, rolling it into the Ottoman ranks. Contemporary witnesses described it creating sustained incendiary effects rather than simple explosion. The mechanism, whether through oil and sulfur additions or through the wheel's construction allowing multiple ignition points, created what sources called fire that sparked even more fire. Picture a watermill wheel, 6 feet in diameter, packed with gunpowder and incendiary compounds released from Eger's elevated walls. It rolled down the slope, building speed, igniting as it went. When it reached massed Ottoman infantry in the approach trenches, it didn't just explode. It showered the area with burning debris. Fragments ignited clothing, siege equipment, wooden mantlets. The sustained burning effect, fire that continued after the initial detonation, created chaos that went beyond the weapon's actual destructive power. The psychological impact was devastating. Ottoman soldiers had faced Greek fire in naval warfare, had used incendiary weapons themselves. But this was different. This was improvised, unpredictable, and coming from a fortress that was supposed to be defending, not attacking. The fire wheels violated Ottoman assumptions about how sieges worked. Defenders were supposed to huddle behind walls, enduring bombardment until they surrendered or were overwhelmed. They weren't supposed to be rolling flaming death machines into elite infantry. But Bornemissa's arsenal extended beyond the fire wheels. Contemporary accounts document that he created primitive but lethal grenades, handheld jars filled with hot resin and shards of metal or stone. Defenders on the walls could hurl these onto siege ladders, creating fragmentation effects that multiplied casualties among climbers. The grenades weren't sophisticated by later standards, but against soldiers compressed on narrow ladders, they didn't need to be. Shrapnel in confined spaces does its work efficiently. The powder keg bombs represented scaled-up versions of the same principle. Large canisters filled with incendiary mixtures could be dropped manually into Ottoman trenches when sappers came too close to the walls. The explosions served multiple purposes: killing enemy miners, destroying their tools and supports, and collapsing the tunnel works before they could reach the foundation. And then there was what defenders called the incendiary soup. Historical sources describe defenders pouring mixtures of boiling oil and pitch that remained flammable even after being poured. This created a cascading fire effect on siege ladders. The first wave of defenders would pour boiling water to create steam burns through armor joints. The second wave would add the oil pitch mixture. The third wave would drop something burning, a torch, a flaming rag. And the entire ladder would become an inferno with Ottoman soldiers trapped between the flames below and Hungarian defenders above. These weren't weapons from military manuals. They were weapons of desperation refined by a scholar who understood that chemistry could multiply force. A 26-year-old Lutheran applying theoretical knowledge to the practical problem of killing as many attackers as possible with limited resources. The Ottoman assaults throughout early October met this arsenal repeatedly. Historical accounts suggest multiple major assaults during the first 2 weeks of October, each repelled with combinations of conventional defense and Bornemissa's innovations. The fire wheels appeared whenever massed infantry concentrated for major push. The grenades rained down on siege ladders. The incendiary compounds turned approach routes into burning gauntlets that soldiers had to cross while under fire from defenders who had perfected their timing through repeated practice. By mid-October, Ottoman soldiers facing another assault order knew what waited. They knew about the fire that multiplied itself. They knew about the burning rain from the walls. They knew that scaling those walls meant running through fire, climbing through fire, and dying in fire if you were unlucky enough to make it to the top where Hungarian axes waited. This knowledge affected combat effectiveness more than actual casualties. When soldiers expect certain death, they hesitate. When they hesitate, assaults lose momentum. when assaults lose momentum, commanders grow frustrated and make increasingly desperate decisions. Bornemisza's genius wasn't in creating devastating weapons, though the fire wheels were certainly effective. His genius was in creating weapons that made Ottoman soldiers fear the act of assault more than they feared their officers' discipline. He weaponized psychology through chemistry, turning terror into a force multiplier that made 250 infantry more effective than their numbers suggested. The scholar who made fire had succeeded beyond even his own expectations. Ottoman veterans who had stormed fortresses from Cairo to Budapest found themselves flinching at the prospect of facing Eger's walls one more time. And when veteran soldiers start flinching, empires start reconsidering their options. But the Ottomans weren't ready to reconsider yet. They had one more card to play: overwhelming force concentrated at a single point, accepting casualties that would horrify military historians, but might finally break the defense through sheer weight of numbers and sustained pressure. October's second week would bring the final crisis, and it would prove whether determination could overcome both geography and chemistry. October 12th through October 17th, 1552. 5 days that would determine whether mathematical superiority could break spiritual defiance. Historical sources document that Eger's strong walls and the high morale of its defenders allowed the fortress to withstand 5 major assaults and continuous cannon fire before the siege ended. Those 5 major assaults came now, compressed into less than a week of sustained combat that pushed both sides to their absolute limits. The Ottoman command structure had fractured under pressure. According to modern historical research analyzing the siege, significant infighting existed between the 2 Ottoman leaders, Pasha Ali and Pasha Ahmed. Ahmed was the senior commander and contributed twice as many troops to the United Army. But Ali showed more strategic talent. By mid-October, this command friction had evolved from professional disagreement into personal animosity. Ahmed wanted massed assaults to overwhelm the fortress through sheer numbers. Ali preferred methodical artillery-focused attrition and precision in timing assaults to coincide with successful mining operations. They compromised by doing both simultaneously, which meant doing neither effectively. The assaults began October 12th with renewed bombardment designed to suppress defensive fire, while Ottoman infantry made another attempt at the damaged northern sections. Contemporary accounts describe fighting all along the walls, with particular intensity at the sectors between the Okaputoroni and the Baliki bastion, where 2 officers, Zoltai Istvan and Bornemissza Gergely, commanded the defense. The assault was repelled, but at cost. Defenders were dying now, not in large numbers. Eger never faced the kind of catastrophic casualties that break morale, but steadily accumulating losses that depleted the garrison's combat strength. October 13th brought what Ottoman commanders believed would be the decisive assault. Maximum force, coordinated timing, acceptance of heavy casualties in exchange for breakthrough. Sources suggest that this may have been the bloodiest single day of the siege, though specific casualty figures aren't documented in surviving chronicles. What we know is that the assault was extremely intense, pushed the defenders to the breaking point at multiple locations, and ultimately failed. One incident from this assault entered the historical record through later accounts. Petho Gaspar, one of the defensive sector commanders, was shot in the leg while leading the defense at the Okaputoroni. He had to be carried away from his post, command passing to subordinates who maintained the defense despite losing their leader. This detail matters because it shows the siege's toll on Hungarian leadership. These weren't anonymous casualties. They were named officers whose loss degraded defensive effectiveness even when their positions held. The October 13th assault's failure created crisis in the Ottoman camp. After a month of siege, after thousands of cannonballs expended, after casualties mounting daily from Hungarian fire and the diseases spreading through the cold, wet camp, after all this investment, Eger's walls still stood. The fortress flag still flew. No breach had been successfully exploited. No sector had collapsed under pressure. Ottoman officers at the tactical level, the commanders who actually led troops into assault, began reporting morale problems. Historical sources document reduced rice rations and allegations of corruption among the officers, causing discontent among Ottoman troops. But beyond the material complaints, there was psychological erosion. Soldiers who had conquered 25 fortresses without serious resistance now faced a garrison that refused to acknowledge mathematical reality. Every assault repelled strengthened Hungarian confidence while weakening Ottoman certainty. October 14th and 15th brought continued pressure but reduced intensity. The Ottomans were running out of ammunition again, their third or fourth shortage of the siege, depending on how you counted. Artillery fell silent for periods. Infantry assaults without adequate covering fire became even more costly. The siege was consuming resources at an unsustainable rate while producing no results beyond mounting casualty lists. By October 16th, even the most optimistic Ottoman assessment had to acknowledge the situation's reality. The fortress would not fall through conventional siege operations in the time remaining, before winter made continued operations impossible. The question was no longer if they could take Eger, but whether continuing to try was worth the cost. That evening, according to sources that would later document the siege's conclusion, the two Ottoman commanders, Ahmed and Ali, had a confrontation that made the previous month's tensions irrelevant. The exact details aren't preserved in chronicles, but multiple accounts mention that the pashas had what later observers described as a significant falling out. They had to make a decision. One more massive assault accepting catastrophic casualties for the possibility of success, or withdrawal, admitting that a second-rate fortress had defeated the Sultan's finest army. October 17th would bring that decision, and with it, an ending that would echo through Hungarian history for centuries. October 17th, 1552. The Ottoman artillery that had fired nearly 12,000 rounds over 39 days fell silent. Not from lack of ammunition this time, from command decision. The siege of Eger was over. Contemporary Hungarian sources document that after the assault on October 13th failed again, discontent and apathy prevailed in the Turkish camp. On October 17th, the pashas abandoned the siege and began their retreat. Some sources cite October 18th as when the last Ottoman units departed, with Ahmed Pasha's troops leaving the 17th and Ali Pasha's forces following the 18th. The slight discrepancy matters less than the unprecedented nature of what was happening. The Ottoman Empire's military machine, which had conquered from Korea to Vienna, was withdrawing from a fortress defended by 2,000 people without achieving its objective. The retreat wasn't panicked flight. Ottoman military discipline held at the organizational level, even as individual morale crumbled. But neither was it a tactical repositioning or strategic withdrawal to better ground. This was abandonment of the siege objective, pure and simple. The army that had arrived in early September expecting victory within days was leaving in mid-October, having failed to take a fortress. It outnumbered 20 to 1. Historical accounts describe the retreat as staged and methodical. For 3 days, Ottoman cannons fired what sources call a farewell bombardment. Artillery fire designed to cover the withdrawal and perhaps salvage some honor from the disaster. The cavalry, protecting the retreat's flanks, set fire to deserted villages nearby, destroying anything that might provide supplies to pursuing Hungarian forces or indicate the route of withdrawal. But pursuit came anyway. Ottoman sources document that their rearguard units had to suffer raids by Dobo's cavalry, forces sent out from the fortress to harry the retreating army. These weren't major battles. The Hungarians lacked the numbers for a decisive engagement, but they could ambush supply wagons, cut off stragglers, and make the Ottoman withdrawal as painful and humiliating as possible. The material cost to the Ottomans was significant, even beyond casualties. Contemporary sources document that siege equipment was abandoned. Catapults that could crack city walls, powder weapons that represented cutting-edge military technology, supplies for what should have been a month's campaign, all left behind in the panic and demoralization of withdrawal. The Hungarians recovered Ottoman artillery pieces, ammunition, and equipment that would prove useful in future defenses. Among the most telling abandonments, personal standards of Ottoman officers, items that warriors would normally die protecting. Honor itself had been left behind in those woods, tangible proof that this wasn't mere tactical repositioning, but psychological collapse. What about casualties? Here, the historical record becomes frustratingly vague. Contemporary sources don't provide specific numbers for Ottoman losses during the siege. We know from the documented intensity of combat, from the 5 major assaults, from the sustained bombardment and counter-battery fire, that casualties occurred. Later estimates vary wildly, from conservative figures in the hundreds to romantic exaggerations in the thousands. Modern historians, lacking primary source documentation, can only note that losses were significant enough to contribute to the decision to withdraw, but not catastrophic enough to destroy the Ottoman army's combat effectiveness. What we can document is the strategic context. Despite the failure at Eger, the 1552 campaign achieved enormous success for the Ottomans. Historical records show they had taken Veszprém, Temesvar, Szolnok, and Lipa, as well as some 25 Hungarian strongholds. The campaign secured the defensive ring around Buda, established the new Temesvar Vilayet, ensuring control over Transylvania, and created strategic depth for future operations. In the grand calculation of empire, one failed siege against 25 successful conquests represented acceptable losses. But empires don't calculate morale in spreadsheets. The psychological impact of Eger transcended the strategic balance sheet. Ottoman soldiers who had marched through Hungary expecting easy conquest now had a story they would tell around campfires. The fortress that wouldn't fall, the defenders who wouldn't surrender, the women who poured molten lead, the fire that multiplied itself. Stories like that spread. They infect confidence. They make the next siege just a little bit harder because soldiers remember that sometimes impossible defenses actually hold. The retreat from Eger, orderly as it was, carried a message that Hungary's remaining defenders desperately needed to hear. The Mongol storm could be weathered. Ottoman superiority wasn't absolute. With the right fortress, the right commander, the right garrison willing to pay any price, resistance was possible. That message would reach Szigetvar in 1566, where another Hungarian commander would face another Ottoman army and choose the same defiance Dobo had chosen. The direct line runs from Eger's walls to Szigetvar's last stand, connected by the knowledge that sometimes dying well matters more than living in submission. As the last Ottoman units disappeared south on October 18th, heading back toward Buda to consolidate their summer's conquests, Eger's defenders began counting their own costs. They had held, but holding had required everything they had. And the man who made it possible was about to discover that Habsburg gratitude came with conditions, complications, and betrayals he hadn't anticipated. October 18th, 1552. The Ottoman banners disappeared beyond the southern horizon. Eger's defenders, those still standing, emerged from positions they had held for 39 days. The fortress had survived. The question was whether the men who defended it would. The physical evidence of siege lay everywhere. Nearly 12,000 cannonball impacts marked the walls and courtyard. Sections of upper battlements had collapsed into rubble. The old gate tower, destroyed by Dobo's own artillery to dislodge Ottoman occupiers, lay in ruins. Siege ladders abandoned in the final withdrawal leaned against walls, some still showing burn marks from incendiary weapons. The smell, gunpowder, smoke, blood, the early stages of decomposition from bodies not yet recovered, filled the air. But casualties among the defenders? Here again. The historical record provides frustration rather than clarity. Contemporary sources don't document specific Hungarian losses during the siege. We know combat occurred daily. We know named officers like Petho Gaspar were wounded. We know the garrison numbered 2,100 to 2,300 at the siege's start. Logic and military experience suggest losses occurred. You don't withstand 5 major assaults, continuous bombardment, and hand-to-hand combat at the walls without casualties. But the exact number? History hasn't preserved it. What history did preserve was the immediate aftermath of victory. And it wasn't celebration. It was protest. Historical sources document that after the victory, Dobo and his officers resigned their commissions in order to protest King Ferdinand's refusal to contribute any material help to the defense. This wasn't a delayed political statement. This was immediate, bitter, angry rejection of the Habsburg monarch who had left Eger to its fate. Dobo had written to Vienna weeks before the siege, requesting reinforcements, supplies, any support. He received nothing, not a single soldier. Not a wagon of gunpowder, not even a letter of encouragement. The garrison had saved Upper Hungary through their own sacrifice, using their own resources, eating their own carefully rationed supplies. And when it was over, when the impossible had been achieved, their reward was nothing. No relief force arrived after the Ottomans withdrew. No Habsburg army pursued the retreating forces. No immediate material support appeared for a garrison that had just performed one of the great defensive feats of the century. Dobo's resignation was a public humiliation for Ferdinand. The commander who had just saved Habsburg territory from Ottoman conquest was openly stating that his own king had abandoned him. The political implications were enormous. If Ferdinand couldn't or wouldn't support fortresses that fought for him, why would other commanders resist Ottoman advances rather than negotiating advantageous surrender terms? The resignation threat worked, at least partially. Ferdinand, recognizing both the political necessity and the genuine military achievement, moved to reward Dobo and prevent his defection to the Transylvanian faction. Contemporary sources record that Bornemissza was appointed to take over command of the fortress shortly after Dobo's departure. Bornemissza, the 26-year-old scholar who had made fire serve Hungary's defense, would now command the fortress his innovations had helped save. But Dobo wouldn't remain in political exile. Historical accounts document Ferdinand's attempts at reconciliation. In recognition of the accomplishment at Eger, King Ferdinand I granted Dobo the towns of Deva and Zamosuivar, now Deva and Gerla in Romania, and in 1553 made him voivode of Transylvania. This was an enormous promotion, from castle captain to prince governor of an entire province. The rewards came with actual revenue streams from the granted territories, making Dobo not just honored, but wealthy. Yet the bitterness remained. When Transylvania was separated from Hungary administratively in 1556, Dobo was given ownership of the castle of Leva, now Levis in Slovakia, in compensation for losing his Transylvanian appointment. He continued serving Habsburg interests, but the relationship was transactional now, defined by mutual necessity rather than loyalty. Dobo had learned that Habsburg support came only after you proved you didn't need it. His later life would prove this lesson repeatedly. In 1566, accused of treason against King Ferdinand, the exact nature of the accusations isn't fully documented, but they appear related to Transylvanian politics and alleged contacts with Ottoman representatives. Dobo was imprisoned in the castle of Pozsony, now Bratislava, in Slovakia. A man who had saved Habsburg Hungary from conquest spent years in a Habsburg prison because politics demanded sacrifices, and dead heroes are more useful than living ones with complicated loyalties. His health, seriously impaired by imprisonment and the accumulated toll of decades of warfare, never recovered. He died in mid-June 1572 in Zaredne, now Serednie in Ukraine, soon after his release from captivity. He was approximately 70 years old. The man who had faced 40,000 Ottomans without flinching died in bed, broken by the political machinery of the kingdom he had defended. History is written by the living, and the living often find it convenient to forget that their victories were purchased by men who received promises, not payment. Dobo's resignation immediately after Eger's defense stands as testimony to a truth rarely acknowledged in triumphant historical narratives: that sometimes victory's bitterness comes not from casualties taken, but from gratitude withheld. But if Dobo's fate was bitter, Gergely Bornemissa's would be tragic. The scholar who made fire, appointed to command the fortress he had helped defend, would serve until 1554, when his story reached its inevitable, terrible conclusion. Gergely Bornemissza commanded Eger Castle for 2 years after the 1552 siege. Contemporary accounts suggest he proved an effective commander, maintaining the fortress's defenses and ensuring the garrison remained prepared for potential Ottoman return. The weapons he had devised during the siege became standard equipment. The tactics he had pioneered, aggressive use of incendiary devices, counter-mining operations, total defense involving all fortress inhabitants, became doctrine. But in 1554, during what should have been a routine patrol or inspection of outlying positions, Ottoman raiders ambushed Bornemissa's small force. Historical records document that he was captured and taken to Constantinople. For the Ottomans, this represented an intelligence coup. The man who had created the weapons that terrorized their assault troops, who understood Eger's defensive systems better than anyone except perhaps Dobo himself, was now in their custody. The interrogation began immediately. Ottoman officials, likely including military engineers and artillery specialists, wanted to know the secrets of Eger's defenses. How did the underground casemates work? What were the formulas for the incendiary weapons? Where were the weak points in the fortress that 40,000 warriors had failed to exploit? What innovations had made 2,000 defenders more effective than their numbers suggested? Historical sources document Bornemissa's response, though we don't have detailed accounts of the interrogation itself. He refused to betray his country. No amount of pressure, no promises of wealth or position, no threats of torture moved him. The scholar who had applied learning to warfare now demonstrated that learning included understanding duty and honor at levels that transcended self-preservation. In 1555, having extracted nothing useful from their prisoner, the Ottomans executed Bornemissza by hanging in Constantinople. He was 29 years old. The man who had terrified an empire died because he wouldn't reveal how he had done it. His death meant more than one man's execution. It meant the permanent loss of his innovations. Bornemissza had never written down the exact formulas for his incendiary compounds. He hadn't created detailed schematics for the firewheel's construction. His knowledge was experiential, practical, stored in memory rather than in manuals. When he died refusing to share that knowledge, the weapons died with him. Later defenders would try to recreate Bornemissza's devices based on the general descriptions that survived in chronicles. They would achieve varying degrees of success. But the precise techniques, the specific proportions, the innovations that made his weapons uniquely effective, those were lost. Ottoman interrogators understood this, which is likely why they eventually gave up and ordered his execution. A prisoner who won't talk and whose knowledge dies with him has negative value. Better to execute him as an example and move on. The example didn't work the way the Ottomans intended. Instead of terrifying Hungarian defenders into surrender or compliance, Bornemissza's execution became another element of the Eger legend. The scholar who chose death over betrayal. The innovator who took his secrets to the grave rather than give them to enemies. The 29-year-old who proved that some knowledge is worth dying to protect. His name became linked inseparably with Istvan Dobo's in the cultural memory of Hungarian resistance. When Géza Gardonyi wrote his 1899 novel Bornemissza, became the protagonist. The young man whose intelligence, courage, and innovations saved Eger. The novel, which became mandatory reading in Hungarian schools and remains culturally significant today, ensured that Bornemissza's legacy would outlive the weapons he created. But legacy doesn't change the facts of his death. A talented young man, an innovator who applied learning to crisis, a commander who had earned his position through demonstrated competence, tortured for information he wouldn't provide, then hanged in a foreign capital far from the fortress he had defended. The Ottoman Empire, which controlled the execution, recorded it as justice against an enemy who had killed their soldiers. Hungarian sources recorded it as martyrdom. Neither interpretation captured the waste. Bornemissza could have contributed more to military science, to engineering, to the defense of Christian Europe. His mind, which had devised the firewheel and improvised weapons from limited resources, could have continued innovating, teaching, advancing the defensive arts that kept smaller forces alive against larger armies. Instead, his life ended on an Ottoman scaffold. His knowledge died with him, and future defenders had to reinvent techniques he had already mastered. The fortress he commanded, Eger Castle, would continue resisting Ottoman advances for another 42 years after his death. But when it finally fell in 1596, Bornemissza's innovations were long forgotten, his formulas lost, his tactical insights buried with him in Constantinople. Sometimes, the price of defiance is paid not in the moment of battle, but in the quiet executions that follow, far from walls that remember, in cities that forget. For 44 years after the 1552 siege, Eger Castle stood as a symbol of successful resistance. The fortress that had defied 40,000 Ottomans became a pillar of the Habsburg defensive system in Hungary. It was strengthened, expanded, and garrisoned with troops who understood they were manning a fortress with a reputation to uphold. But reputations don't stop cannonballs. And in 1596, Eger faced its reckoning. The fortress that fell in 1596 bore little resemblance, militarily, to the one that had held in 1552. Historical sources document that a force of 7,000 defenders, mostly foreign mercenaries, surrendered to Ottoman forces personally commanded by Sultan Mehmed III. 7,000 defenders. More than 3 times the garrison that held in 1552. Better equipped, better supplied, with more artillery and stronger walls than Dobo had commanded. They lasted barely longer than Temesvar had in 1552. The crucial difference: the 1596 garrison lacked what historians call ideological cohesion. These weren't Hungarians defending their homeland alongside peasants and women who refused to flee. These were professional soldiers, largely German and Italian mercenaries, who calculated odds and made rational decisions about when resistance became suicide. When the walls were breached and the situation became untenable, they negotiated surrender rather than fighting to the last man. Contemporary accounts suggest that the surrender involved betrayal from within. Mercenaries, dissatisfied with pay or convinced of inevitable defeat, reportedly rebelled and captured their own commander, then left gates unguarded while negotiating surrender terms with the Ottomans. Only the 300 who converted to Islam were left alive. The rest faced enslavement or execution. The contrast with 1552 couldn't be starker. Dobo's garrison had held for 39 days against 40,000 with 2,000 defenders. The 1596 garrison surrendered to roughly similar numbers with 7,000 defenders and stronger fortifications. The difference wasn't walls or weapons. It was will. Eger remained in Ottoman hands for the next 91 years. The Turks, having finally taken the fortress that had humiliated them in 1552, transformed it into a symbol of their own power. They rebuilt sections damaged during the 1596 siege. They constructed a minaret, the northernmost minaret of the Ottoman Empire, a permanent marker of how far Islamic conquest had penetrated into Christian Europe. Churches became mosques. The castle became the seat of a vilayet, an Ottoman administrative district. But even during 91 years of occupation, the memory of 1552 remained. When Hungarian forces finally retook Eger in 1687 during the Great Turkish War, they found a fortress that had been extensively modified by Ottoman engineers. Yet the basic structure, the walls Dobo had defended, the casemates where Bornemissza had stored his weapons, the bastions where 2,000 had held against 40,000, remained recognizable beneath the Ottoman additions. The liberation of Eger in 1687 represented the beginning of the end for Ottoman power in Hungary. Within 12 years, the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 would formally end the tripartition of Hungary, returning most Hungarian territory to Habsburg control. The Ottoman occupation, which had begun with Mohacs in 1526 and seemed permanent after Buda's fall in 1541, finally collapsed. But the collapse came too late for most of the people who had suffered through nearly 2 centuries of occupation, warfare, and divided loyalties. The Hungary that emerged from Ottoman control was fundamentally different from the kingdom that had existed before Mohacs. The population was smaller, ravaged by warfare and plague. The economy was shattered. Political structures had evolved under both Habsburg and Ottoman administration in ways that made reunification challenging. Yet through all this transformation, one story remained constant in Hungarian cultural memory: the siege of 1552, when Eger refused to fall. The story survived because it answered a question every occupied people must ask. Can resistance matter? When the enemy is stronger, richer, more numerous, and apparently inevitable in victory? Does fighting back accomplish anything beyond hastening your own destruction? Eger's answer: yes. Resistance matters, not because it always wins. The 1596 surrender proved that fortresses eventually fall when circumstances change. But because resistance at the right moment, by the right people, for the right reasons, can delay the inevitable long enough for everything to change. The 3 weeks the Ottomans spent besieging Eger in 1552 were 3 weeks. They couldn't spend advancing toward Vienna or consolidating control over Upper Hungary. The casualties they took, the morale they lost, the momentum they surrendered. All these small victories accumulated into strategic consequences that rippled through decades. The fortress that refused to fall in 1552 eventually fell in 1596. But those 44 years of continued resistance, purchased by Dobo and Bornemissa's defiance, mattered to every person who lived in those years. To every merchant who traded in Upper Hungary's mining towns. To every peasant who farmed land that would have been Ottoman-controlled. To every soldier who gained time to prepare better defenses. To every diplomat who negotiated from a position of marginally greater strength, because Eger still stood. History doesn't measure these delayed consequences easily. They don't fit in casualty tables or territorial maps. But they exist in the accumulated choices of thousands of people whose lives were different because 1552 happened the way it did. The minaret that stood in Eger from the Ottoman occupation until modern times, when it became a tourist attraction rather than an active religious structure, serves as a reminder. The Ottomans did conquer Eger eventually, but eventually isn't immediately. And in the mathematics of empire and resistance, the distance between those two words contains all the meaning that makes stories like 1552 worth remembering. 2,100 defenders against 40,000 elite Ottoman warriors. For 39 days in autumn 1552, the impossible became documented history. Contemporary chronicles from both Christian and Muslim sources confirm the basic facts. Eger Castle, commanded by Istvan Dobo, and defended by a garrison including professional soldiers, peasants, and women, withstood a siege by one of the most powerful armies ever assembled in Central Europe. The Ottoman Empire, at the absolute peak of its military power, withdrew without achieving its objective. The strategic consequences extended beyond the immediate military victory. Historical sources document that the 1552 campaign saw Ottomans capture Veszprém, Temesvar, Szolnok, Lipa, and approximately 25 other Hungarian strongholds. By any calculation, the campaign represented Ottoman success. But Eger's resistance created a psychological break in the narrative of inevitable conquest. The fortress that wouldn't fall became proof that Ottoman superiority had limits. Those limits mattered. Within 14 years, Hungarian defenders at Szigetvar would face similar impossible odds and choose similar defiance, knowing from Eger that such stands had value beyond immediate survival. The knowledge that resistance was possible, even against overwhelming force, spread through the remaining Habsburg territories and stiffened resolve that might otherwise have crumbled into negotiated surrender. The cultural legacy proved even more enduring than the strategic impact. In 1553, just 1 year after the siege, the Hungarian bard Sebastian Tinodi Lantos wrote his chronicle of the defense, providing the earliest documented account of events. This contemporary source, written when survivors still lived and memories remained fresh, established the factual foundation for all later accounts. The siege entered Hungarian oral tradition immediately, kept alive through songs and stories that passed from generation to generation. But the siege's transformation into national legend occurred in the 19th century during the era of Romantic nationalism. The poet Mihaly Vörös-Marty wrote Quote 1 in 1827, the first literary treatment of the siege. Then, in 1899, Géza Gardoni published Quote 2, Quote 3, which became the definitive novelization of the siege. Gardoni's work, based on thorough research into historical sources but elaborated with fictional characters and dialogue, created the version of the siege that entered Hungarian collective memory. The novel's impact cannot be overstated. It became mandatory reading in Hungarian schools and remains culturally significant today. A 1968 film adaptation is still regularly shown on Hungarian television. The story of Dobo, Bornemissza, and the women of Eger became part of Hungarian identity. A reminder that even small nations can resist empires if they're willing to pay the price. That price was high. Dobo spent years imprisoned by the very Habsburg monarch he had served. Bornemissza was executed in Constantinople after refusing to betray the secrets of Eger's defense. The garrison members whose names weren't preserved in chronicles died as anonymously as they lived. The fortress itself eventually fell to the Ottomans in 1596 and remained under Islamic control for 91 years. In the grand strategic calculus, Eger's resistance delayed, but didn't prevent Ottoman conquest of the region. Yet the stand mattered precisely because it couldn't prevent the inevitable. When victory is impossible and survival unlikely, the choice to resist anyway makes a statement that transcends military calculations. The mathematics of siege warfare suggested Eger should have fallen in days. It held for 39. That gap between should and did, that's where meaning lives for everyone who has ever faced impossible odds and chosen to fight anyway. Modern Eger preserves this memory in tangible form. The castle has been partially reconstructed, operating as a museum since 1925. The Istvan Dobo Castle Museum, named in his honor since 1958, displays artifacts from the siege and educates visitors about the defense. Every year, in early August, the city hosts the Border Castle Days Historical Festival, reenacting elements of the siege. At 15:52 each afternoon, 3:52 p.m., a cannon is fired from the castle walls in commemoration. The ritual connects present to past, reminding visitors that history isn't just dates and documents, but choices made by people who knew they might not survive them. The famous painting by Bertalan Szekely, quote, "4 completed in 1867, hangs in the Hungarian National Gallery in Budapest. It depicts a woman defender, castle burning behind her, enemies before her, choosing to fight. The painting synthesizes the siege's meaning into single image. When everything is lost except choice, how you choose defines who you are. Even the legendary bull's blood wine, Egri Bikaver, remains tied to the siege in popular culture, though the connection is probably more legend than fact. The story claims Ottoman soldiers, seeing Hungarian defenders' beards stained red from the wine, believed they were drinking bull's blood for strength and fled in terror. Historical accuracy matters less than what the legend represents. The need to explain impossible events through supernatural means because natural explanations seem insufficient. What makes Eger historically significant isn't the military tactics, though those were innovative. It isn't the fortifications, though those were well designed. It's the demonstration that can multiply force when combined with favorable terrain, intelligent leadership, and total commitment from every person involved in defense. Women pouring molten lead weren't trained soldiers, but they were effective combatants because effectiveness in desperate circumstances comes from determination, not credentials. This lesson, that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to accept that their situation is hopeless, explains why the siege resonates beyond Hungarian borders. Military historians study Eger for its tactical innovations. Cultural historians study it for its role in shaping national identity. But the siege speaks to anyone who has ever been told that resistance is futile and chosen to resist anyway. 2,100 against 40,000. 39 days of sustained combat. Innovations born from desperation. women becoming warriors, a scholar who made fire serve his fortress, a commander who fired on his own positions to save them. And at the end, victory not measured in territory gained, but in time purchased and spirit preserved. The Ottoman Empire would eventually take Eger. It would control much of Hungary for centuries. But on those 39 days in autumn, 1552, in a fortress built on volcanic rock and defended by people who had already decided they would rather die than submit. On those days, the empire learned that some things cannot be conquered, only survived at a price that makes the victory indistinguishable from defeat. That's why, nearly 500 years later, historians still study what happened when a fortress refused to fall. Not because it changed the strategic balance permanently, but because it proved that defiance has meaning, even when defeat seems certain. Especially then, the impossible became documented history. And documentation ensures that as long as people read chronicles, study tactics, or wonder whether resistance matters when the odds are impossible, Eger's answer will remain. It always matters. Because the only true defeat is the choice not to try.